The year was 1868. The place was Concord, Massachusetts, a town of quiet traditions and sturdy clapboard homes. The object was a standard physician's ledger, bound in worn black leather. But on the page for the month of October, beside a tidy list of fevers and fractures, a single name was written and then furiously crossed out. The ink was so thick, so violent, it nearly tore through the fragile paper itself. And beneath the black scar of that redacted name, a note written in the doctor's trembling hand stated a chilling fact. It said that some patients were not meant for examination, for they did not belong to the world of the living. If the forgotten voices of history call to you, and this is your first time here, consider subscribing to join our circle of archivists and keep the past within reach. They arrived on a Tuesday, when the autumn air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The coach came rattling down the main thoroughfare, its wheels caked in the mud of a long journey from some unnamed place to the east. The townspeople of Concord, who were accustomed to a slow and predictable rhythm, paused their duties to watch. It was not often that new faces appeared without preamble, without a letter of introduction sent weeks in advance. From the coach stepped a woman, followed by a boy. The woman, who would later be known as Eleanor Roarke, was wrapped in a heavy woolen shawl the color of ash. Her face was pale and drawn, etched with a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than mere travel. She clutched a small, worn locket at her throat, a nervous, repetitive gesture that spoke of a life recently and violently upended. She was a widow. This was not a fact she offered, but a truth that clung to her like the dust of the road. Behind her stood the 11-year-old Nathaniel Roarke. The boy was the source of the town's immediate and unnerving fascination. He was impossibly still. While other children his age might fidget or gaze about with curiosity, Nathaniel stood as if rooted to the spot, a pale figurine carved from ivory. His hair was the color of straw, and his skin had a translucent quality, a pallor that seemed to drink the light around him rather than reflect it. His eyes, a shade of washed-out gray, did not dart about. They settled on things, on a face in the crowd, on the steeple of the First Parish Church, with an unnerving, unblinking focus. He did not seem to be seeing, so much as recording. They took a small, furnished house for rent at the edge of town, a place that had stood empty for nearly a year. It was modest and unassuming, but their arrival sent a subtle tremor through the community's placid surface. The woman was quiet and kept to herself, but it was the boy who generated the whispers. He was never seen playing, he was never seen running. He was only ever seen standing beside his mother, a silent, watchful shadow. Within a week, Eleanor Roarke began her quiet and desperate campaign. Her first visit was to the office of Dr. Aldous Blackwood. Dr. Blackwood was the town's most respected physician, a man of science and routine in his late 50s. He was a man who believed in logical conclusions and observable facts. His office smelled of carbolic acid, old paper, and pipe tobacco. Every instrument on his tray was polished to a gleam. Every book on his shelf was perfectly aligned. He was known for his steady hands and his calming, if somewhat detached, bedside manner. He took pride in the order he had imposed on the chaotic world of human frailty. Eleanor sat before his large oak desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She spoke in a low, controlled voice. She said her son, Nathaniel, was unwell. She said he was prone to sudden fainting spells, collapsing without warning. She told the doctor of fevers that would appear from nowhere, making his skin burn for an hour before vanishing, as if they had never been. Her story was one of a worried mother, a narrative Dr. Blackwood had heard in countless variations over his 30 years of practice. He nodded patiently, making a few notes with his fountain pen. He said he would of course need to examine the boy. He motioned for Nathaniel, who had been sitting perfectly still on a chair by the door, to come forward. The boy rose and walked toward the examination table. He did not shuffle or hesitate. His movements were fluid and precise, and utterly silent. Dr. Blackwood turned to prepare his instruments. He picked up his stethoscope, its cold metal disc, a familiar weight in his palm. When he turned back, the boy was standing beside the table, watching him. And in that moment, the sterile, ordered world of Dr. Blackwood's office seemed to shift. A faint chill had entered the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn draft. The doctor felt the fine hairs on his arms stand up. He told himself it was merely a child's nervousness. He said hello to the boy. Nathaniel did not reply. He simply continued to gaze at the doctor with those pale, empty eyes. There was no fear in them. There was no curiosity. There was nothing at all. It was like looking into two discs of polished river stone. Dr. Blackwood took a step forward, raising the stethoscope. He meant to place it on the boy's chest, but as he drew near, the feeling of cold intensified. It was not a physical temperature drop, but something else, an internal chill that settled deep in his bones. He felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of revulsion, a primal instinct to pull back. He looked at the boy's skin. It was flawless, but it did not look like the skin of a living child. It was like fine porcelain, smooth and cold, and without the blush of life beneath it. His hand, the steady hand that had set bones and stitched wounds, stopped in midair. He could not bring himself to touch the boy. The scientific part of his mind screamed that this was absurd, a failing of his nerve, but a deeper, older part of his brain, a part he had long since suppressed with logic and learning, warned him away. It told him he was standing on the edge of a precipice. He lowered his hand. He cleared his throat. He turned back to his desk, his movements suddenly stiff and awkward. He told Eleanor Roarke that his schedule was quite full. He said the boy's symptoms sounded complex, perhaps neurological in nature. He suggested that a specialist in Boston would be far better equipped to diagnose such a peculiar case. His voice was firm, professional, but it lacked its usual warmth. It was the voice of a man building a wall. Eleanor Roarke's face fell. A flicker of something, not just disappointment, but a deep, familiar dread, passed through her eyes. She began to protest quietly. She said they had little money for travel. She said Dr. Blackwood came highly recommended. She pleaded with him just to listen to the boy's heart. Dr. Blackwood refused. He was already writing a name on a piece of paper, a colleague in Boston he had not spoken to in 10 years. He pushed it across the desk. He said he could do no more. He stood up, a clear signal that the consultation was over. He would not look at the boy again. He kept his eyes fixed on the mother, on the door, on anywhere but the pale, still child who was now watching him with an unnerving placidity. As mother and son left the office, Dr. Blackwood sank into his chair, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow. The lingering cold in the room took a long time to fade. He did not write the boy's name in his ledger. He could not bring himself to make such a permanent record of the encounter. Undeterred, Eleanor Roarke sought a second opinion. She took her son to the smaller, less imposing practice of Dr. Miles Croft. Dr. Croft was a younger man, barely 30, and had been in Concord for only 2 years. He was eager to build his reputation and his list of patients. He was known to be kind, if a little unsure of himself. His office was cluttered, filled with the scent of new leather from his medical bag and the faint, sweet smell of the tinctures he was still learning to mix properly. He listened to Eleanor's story with genuine sympathy. He nodded in all the right places, his expression one of deep concern. He assured her that they had come to the right place. He said that complex cases were a welcome challenge. He exuded an air of youthful confidence that seemed, for a moment, to soothe Eleanor's frayed nerves. He turned to the boy, who was seated in the corner, as still and silent as he had been in the previous office. Dr. Croft smiled warmly. He said there was nothing to be afraid of. He approached Nathaniel with a gentle, reassuring energy. He knelt down so he was at the boy's eye level. He asked Nathaniel his name. The boy did not respond. He simply tilted his head, a slow, deliberate motion. Dr. Croft's smile faltered. He was looking into the boy's eyes, and he felt a sudden, dizzying sensation, as if he were looking down a long, dark well. He felt a strange pressure in his mind, a fleeting, intrusive thought that was not his own. For a terrifying second, he saw an image of the small cottage where he had been born, a place hundreds of miles away that he had not seen in 15 years. The image was vivid, perfect in every detail, from the crack in the plaster ceiling to the pattern of the quilt on the bed. He blinked, and the vision was gone. He stood up abruptly, a wave of vertigo washing over him. He stumbled back a step. The boy had not moved. His expression had not changed, but the room now felt wrong. The air was thick and heavy. Dr. Croft looked at Eleanor Roarke, his face now ashen. The confidence had drained out of him, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He stammered. He said he had made a mistake. He said the boy's condition was far beyond his capabilities. He echoed Dr. Blackwood's words almost exactly. He said a specialist in Boston was the only answer. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over one another. He was not making a medical recommendation. He was trying to get them out of his office. He nearly pushed them toward the door, his hands trembling. He told Eleanor not to return. He said, with a final, desperate emphasis, that there was nothing he could do for her son. The pattern of refusal had been set. A third physician, an old, semi-retired man who mostly treated livestock, took one look at the boy sitting on his porch, and told Eleanor Roarke he was no longer seeing human patients. A lie so blatant it was insulting. The doors of science and medicine in Concord were closing to Nathaniel Roarke. They were not closing because his ailment was too complex, but because the men of medicine were afraid. They could not articulate the fear. It was not in their textbooks. It was a cold, ancient dread that defied diagnosis. The story of the boy who no physician would touch began to circulate. It started as a murmur, a piece of gossip exchanged over a fence post or in the general store. But it grew in power, fueled by the visible discomfort of the town's most rational men. It was the town midwife, a woman named Martha Gable, who gave the fear a texture, a physical dimension. Martha was a formidable woman in her 60s, with a face like a weathered map and hands that had brought half the town into the world. Her hands were her trademark. They were always warm, a source of profound comfort to women in the throes of labor. She was practical, deeply rooted in the physical realities of life and death. She had little time for fanciful stories. She encountered Eleanor and Nathaniel in the town square. She saw the familiar anxiety in the mother's eyes and the unnatural stillness of the child. Pity and professional curiosity moved her. She approached them, offering a kind word to Eleanor. She dismissed the town's talk as idle gossip. She said children often had strange, passing afflictions. To offer a small gesture of comfort, she reached out and gently took Nathaniel's arm, intending to pat it reassuringly. The contact lasted only a second, but for Martha Gable, it felt like an eternity. A profound, shocking cold blasted through her hand, up her arm, and into her chest. It was not the simple cold of a chilly day. It was a deep, penetrating cold, the cold of a deep cellar, of a tomb. It was a dead, lifeless cold that seemed to pull the heat from her own body. Her famously warm hand felt instantly numb, violated. She snatched her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the boy's arm where she had touched it. Through his pale, almost transparent skin, she could see the veins beneath, but they were not the healthy blue or green of a normal child. They were dark, almost black, a web of inky lines spreading out from his wrist. They looked less like blood vessels and more like cracks in porcelain, filled with something dark and ancient. Nathaniel turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were devoid of emotion, but Martha felt a sudden, terrifying certainty that he knew exactly what she had just felt. He knew the cold she had touched. Martha Gable, the unshakable midwife, was shaken. She mumbled an incoherent apology and hurried away, rubbing her hand as if to restore its warmth, to erase the memory of that unnatural chill. She did not look back. Her story spread faster than any of the others. It was not a rumor from a nervous doctor's office. It was a physical account from the most grounded woman in Concord. The boy was cold as iron. His veins were black. These were not symptoms. They were portents. The isolation of the Roarkes became complete. They were no longer just newcomers. They were pariahs. People would cross the street to avoid walking on the same side as them. Mothers would call their children indoors if they saw the pale boy standing in his yard. The house at the edge of town became an object of fear and speculation, its windows like vacant eyes in the falling twilight. From the window of the First Parish Rectory, Father Alistair Finch watched it all unfold. He was a young priest, more of a scholar than a firebrand, a man who preferred the quiet study of theology to the messy realities of his flock's superstitions. He had heard the stories, from the doctor's coded warnings to the midwife's terrified testimony. He saw the fear curdling the good-natured spirit of his town, turning neighbors into suspicious strangers. He did not believe in monsters. He believed in God, and he believed in affliction, both of the body and of the soul. He felt the weight of his duty. To leave a mother and her sick child so utterly abandoned was a failure of Christian charity. To allow fear and superstition to rule his community was a failure of his leadership. He watched the small house as darkness fell over Concord. A single lamp was lit in a downstairs window, a small, lonely point of light against the encroaching dread. He knew the whispers would only grow louder, more dangerous, in the dark. He made a decision. The fear had to be confronted with reason. The shadow had to be met with light. He would not go to the house himself, not yet. First, he would go to the man of science. He would appeal to Dr. Aldous Blackwood, the most respected and rational man in town. He would persuade him, implore him, to do his duty, to set aside his fear and conduct a proper examination to put an end to the madness. It was, he believed, the only path back to sense and sanity. He had no way of knowing he was about to open a door that could never be closed again. The knock on Dr. Aldous Blackwood's door came late, long after the town of Concord had surrendered to the autumn night. It was not the urgent, frantic pounding of a medical emergency, but a steady, patient rapping. The doctor, sitting alone in his study amidst his books and anatomical charts, felt a jolt of apprehension. He had not been able to settle since his encounter with the Roarke boy. The memory of the child's empty eyes and the inexplicable chill had seeped into the very timbers of his office. He had been trying to lose himself in a medical journal, but the words swam before his eyes, meaningless. He opened the door to find Father Alistair Finch standing on his threshold. The young priest's face was illuminated by the gas lamp in the hall, his expression serious and determined. A gust of cold wind followed him inside, but it was a familiar, natural cold, a stark contrast to the memory that haunted the room. The doctor invited him in, though he knew the reason for the visit. He could see it in the priest's posture, in the way his jaw was set. Father Finch did not waste time with pleasantries. He stood in the center of the study, a dark figure against the shelves of leather-bound knowledge. He said he had come about the boy, Nathaniel Roarke. Dr. Blackwood moved behind his desk, creating a barrier of solid oak between himself and the priest's purpose. He said there was nothing to discuss. He had already given the mother his best recommendation. The case required a specialist. Father Finch's gaze was unflinching. He spoke of the town. He said that fear was a sickness, and it was spreading faster than any fever he had ever seen. He described the whispers, the way neighbors were looking at each other with suspicion. He told the doctor about Martha Gable's encounter, how the midwife's story of a deathly cold touch in black veins had given the fear a terrible, physical form. The priest argued that this could not be allowed to fester. Superstition, he said, was a darkness that reason and faith were meant to combat. The doctor ran a hand over his face. He felt a weariness that went bone deep. He tried to explain his reluctance, but the words felt inadequate, foolish. He said it was not a matter of superstition. He said there was something wrong in a way he could not measure or name. He spoke of the cold that was not a temperature. He spoke of the boy's stillness, a placidity so profound it felt like a violation of the laws of life. He confessed that he had felt a revulsion, a deep and primal warning in his soul that told him not to touch the child. He said that in all his years of practice, through epidemics and horrific injuries, he had never once hesitated to lay his hands on a patient. Until that boy. Father Finch listened patiently, his expression unwavering. When the doctor finished, the priest took a step closer to the desk. He said he understood the doctor's unease, but he suggested that what the doctor felt was simply a powerful, uncanny manifestation of an unknown ailment. He argued that fear itself could produce physical sensations, a chill, a feeling of dread. He proposed that the only way to defeat this fear, both in the doctor and in the town, was to confront it with facts, a proper examination, a documented record of the boy's vital signs. A methodical, scientific inquiry that would either reveal a natural, explainable cause for his condition or prove that there was nothing wrong with him at all. He said a page of medical notes, no matter how unusual, was a better weapon against gossip than 100 sermons on charity. The priest's logic was a fortress. It was the same logic the doctor had built his own life upon. To deny it was to deny the very foundation of his profession, and yet every instinct screamed at him to refuse. He looked around his office, at the tools of his trade, the symbols of order and reason. They seemed to offer no protection against the memory of Nathaniel Roarke. He told the priest that there are some things that science was not equipped to understand. He said that touching the boy felt like a trespass. Father Finch's voice softened, but lost none of its resolve. He asked what was more of a trespass, a medical examination, or the complete abandonment of a child and his grieving mother by their community. He said their duty, as men of science and men of God, was to the vulnerable, regardless of how unsettling their affliction might be. He said if Dr. Blackwood would not go, the fear would continue to grow, and what began as whispers could easily curdle into something far worse. He did not need to elaborate. Both men knew the dark histories of small towns, how fear could ignite into accusation, and accusation into violence. The weight of this responsibility settled on Dr. Blackwood. He looked at the priest's earnest, determined face and saw the reflection of his own forgotten ideals. He had become a doctor to solve mysteries, to bring light to the dark corners of human suffering. Now he was hiding from a shadow. He sighed, a long, slow exhalation of defeat. He said he would do it, but he would not do it alone. He told the priest that he must accompany him. Father Finch agreed without hesitation. He said he would be a witness, for the town's sake and for the doctor's. They walked through the sleeping town under a sliver of moon. The familiar streets seemed alien and foreboding. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe at the edge of their vision. The doctor carried his black leather bag, its contents of steel and glass and bottled chemicals, feeling like useless talismans against a foe he could not name. He felt the dread returning with every step, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He was a man of science, walking toward an act he felt was profoundly unscientific, a surrender to a pressure he could not rationalize. Father Finch walked beside him, his stride steady. He murmured that God's world contained many mysteries, but that did not mean they were malevolent. He said clarity was all they were seeking. The doctor did not reply. He was focused on the approaching house at the edge of town. The Roarke house was almost entirely dark. A single lamp still burned in a downstairs window, a weak yellow glow against the oppressive blackness. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. As they approached the gate, the doctor felt the unnatural chill again, faint at first, but growing stronger with every step. It was as if the property itself emanated a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. The priest, too, seemed to feel it. He pulled his coat a little tighter around his shoulders, a subtle, almost unconscious gesture. Dr. Blackwood lifted the iron latch of the gate. The screech it made in the silence was sharp and painful. They walked up the short path to the front door. The doctor raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. His knuckles hovered inches from the wood. It took him a moment to force his hand to complete the motion. The door was opened by Eleanor Roarke. Her face, illuminated by the lamp she held, was a mask of weary surprise. Her eyes darted from the doctor to the priest, a flicker of confusion followed by a dawning, desperate hope. She did not ask why they had come. She simply stepped back, holding the lamp high, and allowed them to enter. The inside of the house was colder than the night outside. It was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to cling to the very air. The front room was furnished sparsely with a table, 2 chairs, and a small sofa. Everything was impeccably clean, unnervingly so. There were no books, no stray papers, no needlepoint left on a chair. There was no clutter of life. The air was still and smelled faintly of dust and something else, something vaguely metallic and unpleasant. Nathaniel Roarke was sitting on one of the chairs, his back perfectly straight, his hands folded in his lap. He was exactly as the doctor remembered him, pale, still, and silent. He turned his head slowly as they entered, and his gray eyes fixed upon them. He showed no surprise, no curiosity. He simply observed their arrival as if it were an event he had been expecting. Eleanor Roarke gestured toward her son. She said he had been quiet all evening. She said he had refused his dinner. Her voice was thin, brittle with anxiety. Dr. Blackwood placed his bag on the table with a heavy thud. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence of the room. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He told himself this was a medical procedure. He was a professional. He would be methodical. He turned to Father Finch. He asked him to stand near the lamp, to provide as much light as possible. The priest nodded, his own face now pale and tight. He was no longer just a scholar urging reason. He was a witness to something that was beginning to feel profoundly unreasonable. The doctor approached the boy. He said his name, Nathaniel. He explained that he was there to perform a proper examination, to see if he could help. The boy did not reply. He did not even blink. He just watched, his gaze unnerving in its intensity. Dr. Blackwood began. He gently unbuttoned the top of the boy's simple cotton shirt. As his fingers brushed against the boy's skin, he flinched. It was as cold as Martha Gable had described. It was the cold of marble, of a stone drawn from the bottom of a deep well. There was no life, no warmth to it at all. He forced himself to continue, his movements stiff. He took the stethoscope from his bag. The metal disc was already cold, but it felt warm compared to the boy's chest. He placed the disc against the pale skin, just over the heart. He put the earpieces in and listened. There was silence. An absolute, profound silence. He heard the rush of his own blood in his ears, the frantic thumping of his own heart. But from the boy, there was nothing. A wave of panic rose in him. This was impossible. The boy was sitting upright. He was breathing, a shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. He had to be. He adjusted the stethoscope, pressing it harder against the boy's icy skin. He strained to listen, concentrating with all his might, shutting out the sound of his own terror. And then he heard it. It was not a heartbeat, not in any way he understood. It was a sound, a single, low, resonant beat. Thump. It was impossibly slow. It was heavy, like the tolling of a great iron bell far away. It was followed by a long, unnerving stillness, a silence that stretched for 5 seconds, then 6, then 7. The doctor found himself holding his breath, waiting for the next beat. When it finally came, the heavy thump echoed in the earpieces with a dreadful finality. Thump. He pulled his pocket watch out, his hand shaking so badly he could barely read the numbers. He timed the beats. There were only 8 in a full minute. 8. A healthy child's heart should beat nearly 100 times in a minute. Even a man in the deepest sleep would have a pulse of 50 or 60. 8 beats per minute was not life. It was a mechanical, lingering echo of it. He felt dizzy, nauseous. He quickly scribbled the number in his small notebook, his handwriting a barely legible scrawl. He put the stethoscope away, his hands fumbling with the clasp of his bag. He moved on, trying to maintain a clinical detachment that he no longer felt. He took a small light to examine the boy's eyes. He gently lifted one of the boy's eyelids. The gray iris was clear, but the pupil was a fixed, dilated black disc. It did not react to the light. It did not constrict. And the boy's gaze. It was not vacant. It was focused. But it was focused on something far beyond the room, beyond the house, beyond the town of Concord itself. Looking into the boy's eyes, the doctor felt a terrifying sensation of scale, as if he were peering through a keyhole into a vast, cold, empty cosmos. He felt an intelligence there, an ancient, patient awareness that was looking back at him not from the boy, but through him. He staggered back, breathing heavily. He had seen enough. More than enough. He knew, with a certainty that transcended science, that this was no sickness. This was something else, something other. He turned to the mother, his voice strained. He said he could find nothing. It was then that the boy spoke for the first time. His voice was not the voice of an 11-year-old child. It was soft, clear, and perfectly modulated, without emotion or inflection. He did not speak to the doctor. He spoke to the room. He said the doctor's childhood home had a loose floorboard under the bed in the smallest bedroom. He said it was where the doctor used to hide his collection of bird eggs. The doctor froze. The blood drained from his face. No one could know that. No one alive. His family was long dead. The house sold and torn down 30 years ago. The boy continued to speak, his voice a calm, chilling monotone. He spoke of the water stain on the ceiling of the kitchen, the one his mother always said looked like the profile of a bearded man. He spoke of the way the back door would stick in the humid summer months. He spoke of a small, carved wooden horse, with one leg missing that the doctor's father had made for him, a toy he had lost in the tall grass behind the barn when he was 7 years old. He described it perfectly. Each detail was a hammer blow, shattering the foundations of the doctor's world. This was not a lucky guess. This was not a child's fantasy. This was his life. His most private, forgotten memories, recounted with perfect, unnerving accuracy by a boy he had never met, a boy with cold skin and a heart that barely beat. Dr. Aldous Blackwood made a strangled sound in his throat. He began to gather his things, shoving instruments into his bag with frantic, clumsy movements. He could not look at the boy. He could not bear to meet those knowing, ancient eyes. Father Finch stood by the lamp, his face a portrait of stunned disbelief. He had heard it too. He had seen the terror bloom on the doctor's face. The scholar's confidence had evaporated, replaced by the same raw fear he now saw in the doctor. The doctor snapped his bag shut. He turned to Eleanor Roarke, his eyes wide with a terror he did not try to conceal. He told her to never, under any circumstances, seek his services again. He said her son was not sick. His voice cracked as he spoke the next words. He said he did not know what the boy was, but he was not a patient. He warned her not to let anyone else examine him. The warning was not for the boy's sake. It was for theirs. Without another word, he turned and fled the house, stumbling out into the cold night air, a man of science running from an impossible truth. Father Alistair Finch remained for a moment, rooted to the spot, caught between the fleeing doctor and the silent family. He looked at Nathaniel Roarke, who now sat as he had before, a pale, still figure in a cold, quiet room, his work apparently done. The priest then turned and followed the doctor, leaving the mother and son alone in their sterile, isolated world, the single lamp casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. The examination was over, but a far more terrible investigation had just begun. The night of the reluctant examination left a scar on the town of Concord. Dr. Aldous Blackwood did not speak of what had happened in the Roarke house. He did not have to. The terror he carried with him was a palpable thing, a scent of fear that clung to his clothes and haunted his eyes. He became withdrawn, his once steady hands now prone to a slight tremor. He took to locking his office door during the day, admitting patients with a new, guarded suspicion. When asked about the Roarke boy, he would only shake his head, his face ashen, and say that some doors are best left unopened. Father Alistair Finch was similarly changed. The scholarly confidence that had defined him was fractured. He had been a witness to the impossible. He had heard the boy's chilling recitation of the doctor's most private memories. He had felt the profound, unnatural cold of that house, a cold that seemed to have followed him back to the rectory. He began to keep the fires in his study burning high, even on mild days. He spent long hours in the church, not in quiet contemplation, but in fervent, almost desperate prayer. The priest's sermons took on a new, darker tone. He no longer spoke of God's boundless love and the promise of salvation. He spoke of afflictions of the spirit. He warned of unseen evils that walk in the world, masquerading as simple misfortune. He cautioned his congregation against a spiritual sickness that could take root in a community, feeding on fear and doubt. He did not mention the Roarkes by name, but everyone in the pews knew who he was talking about. His words were meant to be a comfort, a call to faith, but they only served to deepen the town's anxiety. The boy was no longer just a strange newcomer. He was now an affliction, a spiritual blight upon Concord. The town's fear, once a collection of whispers and rumors, began to manifest in tangible ways. The strange occurrences started small, easily dismissed as coincidence or the work of predators. A farmer on the west side of town, a man named Silas Croft, found one of his sheep dead in its pen. This was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was the manner of its death. There were no marks on the animal, no signs of a struggle. Its wool was not torn, the ground around it not disturbed. But the sheep was completely drained of blood. There were 2 small, precise puncture marks on its neck, so clean they looked as if they had been made by a surgeon's tool. Silas Croft told the constable it was the work of a fox, but he knew foxes were messy killers. This was something else, something clean, quiet, and unnervingly efficient. A week later, another farmer, 2 miles to the north, found a milk cow in his barn, dead in its stall. It was the same story. The cow was lying peacefully on the hay, as if it had simply fallen asleep, but it was cold and lifeless, drained of all its blood. Again, 2 small neat holes were found on its neck. The constable investigated. He found no tracks leading to or from the barn, save for those of the farmer himself. The latch on the barn door had been secured from the inside. The stories of the bloodless livestock spread like wildfire. The word that was whispered in hushed tones was unnatural. The fear in Concord began to change. It was no longer just a social anxiety about a strange family. It was becoming a primal dread, a fear of a predator that left no tracks and made no sound. Then, the affliction moved from the barns and the fields to the homes of the townspeople. It came for the children. It began with the tapping. Several children, all living in houses that bordered the woods or the darker, unlit lanes of the town, began to speak of a tapping sound at their bedroom windows in the dead of night. It was not the frantic scratching of a tree branch in the wind. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. A sound like a fingernail on glass, patient and persistent. The first child to speak of it was a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Miller. She told her parents that a pale man had been looking in her window. Her father, a practical blacksmith, dismissed it as a bad dream. He nailed a loose shingle on the roof and told her the noise was gone. But the next night, Sarah woke up screaming. She said the pale man was back. She said his face was right up against the glass, and his eyes were like gray stones. When her father burst into the room, there was nothing there but the blackness of the night. Other children reported the same thing. A 10-year-old boy, the son of the town baker, claimed he saw a pale face retreat from his window and disappear into the darkness. He said it moved without a sound. A pair of young sisters who shared a room both swore they were awakened by the tapping and saw a thin, shadowy figure standing by the old oak tree in their yard, watching their house. Parents tried to rationalize the stories. They were nightmares, they said. They were shadows from the moon, the product of overactive imaginations fueled by the town's growing hysteria. But the stories were too similar, too consistent. The tapping, the pale face, the silent retreat into the darkness. The children of Concord became afraid of the night. Windows were shuttered and locked. Extra blankets were piled on beds, as if to form a barricade against the thing that tapped in the dark. The terror in the town was now a constant, low hum, a background noise to daily life. And at the center of this web of fear stood the small, silent house at the edge of town. No one had seen Nathaniel Roarke commit any of these acts. He was never seen outside of his own yard during the day, but in the collective mind of Concord, the connection was absolute. The pale boy and the pale face at the window were one and the same. The cold that emanated from the boy was the same cold that now seemed to settle over the town each night when the sun went down. Father Alistair Finch found himself in a crisis of faith and duty. His prayer meetings, once sparsely attended, were now overflowing. The church was filled with frightened faces, people looking to him for answers he did not have. He led them in prayers for protection, for deliverance from the evil that had taken root among them. His voice boomed through the sanctuary, but in the quiet of his study, he was consumed by doubt and a gnawing fear. He sought out Dr. Blackwood again. He found the doctor in his office late one night, not reading his journals, but staring blankly at a wall. The room was thick with the smell of stale pipe tobacco and something else, the scent of a deep and abiding fear. The priest did not bother with pleasantries. He told the doctor about the livestock. He told him about the children, about the tapping at the windows. He asked the doctor, as a man of science, if there could be any rational explanation. Dr. Blackwood looked at the priest, his eyes weary and haunted. He said there was no rational explanation for an animal to be drained of its blood without a single sign of a struggle. He said there was no rational explanation for a child's heart to beat only 8 times in a minute. He slowly opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out the small notebook from his examination of Nathaniel. He opened it to the page where he had scrawled his notes. He pointed to the number 8. He said life, as they knew it, could not be sustained on that. He said what they had examined in that house was not a living boy in any biological sense they understood. He then shared a detail he had not mentioned to the priest before. He spoke of the boy's eyes, of the feeling that he was not just looking at the room, but through it, at something vast and distant. He confessed the boy's recitation of his childhood memories. He told the priest how Nathaniel had described the lost wooden horse, a secret the doctor thought he had carried alone for nearly 50 years. Father Finch listened, his face growing paler with each word. The last vestiges of his scholarly skepticism crumbled into dust. He had tried to frame this as a spiritual affliction, a metaphor for the town's fear. But the doctor's testimony, the cold, hard numbers in his notebook, pointed to something else. This was not a metaphor. It was a physical reality, a monstrous intrusion into their world. The priest sat down heavily in the chair opposite the doctor's desk. He confided in the doctor his own deepest fear. He said that in his studies of theology, he had read of such things, not in the mainstream scriptures, but in older, more obscure texts. Apocryphal writings that spoke of beings that were neither living nor dead, things that lingered in the spaces between, feeding on the life force of others. They were described as shades, as hollow things that wore the skins of humans but had nothing of humanity inside them. He had always dismissed these as allegories, as folk tales meant to warn against spiritual decay. Now, he was not so sure. He told the doctor he feared they were not dealing with a sick boy. He feared they were dealing with an ancient hunger, an entity that had come to Concord wearing the face of a child. He spoke the word quietly, a word he had never uttered with any seriousness in his entire life. He said he feared it was a demon. The doctor, the man of science, did not laugh. He did not dismiss it. He simply nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the notebook in his hands. In the face of the impossible evidence, the unthinkable had become a plausible diagnosis. They sat in silence for a long time, 2 pillars of the community, a man of God and a man of science, united in their terror. The foundations of their world had been shaken loose. The tidy order of faith and reason had been shattered by a pale boy with cold skin and eyes that saw into the past. They had no answers. They had no weapons. All they had was the shared knowledge that the thing in the Roarke house was patient. The dead livestock, the tapping at the windows, these were not random acts. They were tests. They were explorations. The creature was learning its new territory. It was growing bolder. And as they sat in the dim light of the doctor's office, a cold wind rattling the window frames, they both felt the same dreadful premonition. This was only the beginning. The whispers in the night were a prelude. The real horror had not yet begun. The entity was still testing the fences, learning the patterns of the flock. Soon, it would tire of sheep and cattle. Soon, its hunger would turn toward the town itself, and neither of them had any idea how to stop it. The tapping at the windows was a promise that it could get to anyone, a promise of what was to come. The brittle peace in Concord, already stretched thin by weeks of mounting dread, finally snapped on a moonless night in early November. The air had turned sharp with the first real bite of winter, and the bare, skeletal branches of the trees clawed at a sky the color of slate. The fear that had been a constant, low hum in the town was about to crescendo into a piercing shriek. The person at the center of this new terror was a 9-year-old girl named Lydia Bellows. She was the only daughter of a widowed farmer, Thomas Bellows, whose small plot of land bordered the dense, dark woods that stretched for miles to the north. Lydia was a quiet, dutiful child, known for her bright red ribbons and her habit of humming to herself as she did her chores. She was the small, fragile light in her father's solitary life. She had a fondness for collecting smooth gray stones from the creek bed, which she kept in a small wooden box beside her bed. On that Tuesday night, Thomas Bellows put his daughter to bed as he always did. He read her a passage from the Bible, tucked the quilt tightly around her shoulders, and kissed her forehead. He remembered her asking if he had locked the windows. It was a question all the children in Concord were asking now. He assured her that everything was safe and secure. He went downstairs, sat by the dwindling fire for an hour, and then retired to his own room, exhausted from a long day of preparing his fields for the coming frost. He awoke just before dawn to an unnerving silence. The usual sounds of the house were absent. There was no soft stirring from Lydia's room, no creak of the floorboards as she made her way to the wash basin. A cold spike of anxiety pierced his morning grogginess. He got out of bed and walked across the cold wooden floor to his daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The quilt was thrown back, and the small indentation of her head was still visible on the pillow. But Lydia was gone. Her small wooden box of stones was overturned on the floor, its contents scattered across the floorboards like forgotten teeth. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He called her name. His voice was a raw, desperate croak in the silent house. He ran downstairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The main door was unbolted. He had checked it himself before going to bed. He knew he had. He threw the door open and stumbled out into the gray, pre-dawn light, screaming her name into the cold air. The search began within the hour. The constable was roused, and word spread from farm to farm with the terrifying speed of a fire bell. Men left their chores, grabbing lanterns and rifles, their faces grim. The women of the town gathered at the Bellows farm, bringing food they knew Thomas could not eat, and offering comfort that could not penetrate his wall of shock and grief. Dr. Blackwood and Father Finch arrived together. The doctor's face was a stony mask, but his eyes betrayed a deep, horrified certainty. The priest moved through the growing crowd, his expression grim, offering prayers that felt hollow and inadequate against the raw reality of a missing child. The search party fanned out from the house. They found the footprints immediately. Small, bare footprints in the thin layer of frost that coated the ground. They led away from the front door, straight across the yard, toward the dark, ominous line of the forest. The men followed the tracks, their lanterns cutting feeble paths through the gloom. The footprints were steady, evenly spaced. They were not the prints of a child running in terror. They were the prints of a child walking calmly, deliberately, as if being led by an unseen hand. They walked with a purpose that was terrifying in its implications. The trail of tiny, bare footprints continued for 100 yards, right to the edge of the woods. And there, at the point where the frost-covered grass gave way to the tangled undergrowth and dark soil of the forest floor, they stopped. They simply ceased to exist. There was no sign of a struggle. No scuffed earth, no broken twigs. No other set of tracks, large or small, was found anywhere nearby. It was as if the girl had walked to the edge of the woods and had been lifted straight up into the air, vanishing into the darkness between the trees. The men stared at the spot, a profound and supernatural dread settling over them. It was a violation of all known physical laws. The men pushed into the forest, shouting her name until their throats were raw. They searched all day, a desperate, frantic combing of the dense woods. They found nothing. No scrap of her nightgown, no red ribbon, no sign that she had ever entered the forest at all. As dusk began to fall, a chilling rain began, turning the woods into a labyrinth of slick, dripping darkness and washing away any hope of finding her trail. The search was called off for the night, the men returning to their homes with a new, deeper fear in their hearts. They had not just failed to find a lost child, they had come face to face with the impossible. While the search continued in the woods, the fear back in the town began to find its focus. The whispers that had once been formless now had a name. They spoke of Nathaniel Roarke, Two separate accounts surfaced, both from reliable, sober-minded men who had been out late the previous night. The first was from the night watchman, a man named Peters, who had been making his rounds near the river that snaked along the eastern edge of Concord. He reported seeing a figure standing by the riverbank, a pale shape barely visible in the gloom. He thought it was a trespasser or a poacher and had called out. The figure did not respond. As he got closer, he realized it was a boy, barefoot and clad only in a thin white nightshirt despite the freezing temperature. He said the boy was staring down into the dark, rushing water, his hands held out in front of him, and he was murmuring. The watchman could not make out the words. He said it was not a language he had ever heard before. It was a string of soft, guttural sounds, rhythmic and hypnotic. Unsettled, the watchman had turned to fetch the constable. When he looked back a moment later, the boy was gone. He had vanished without a sound. The second account came from a farmer returning late from a trip to a neighboring town. His wagon had passed the lane leading to the Roarke house around midnight. He swore he saw the boy, Nathaniel, standing barefoot in the middle of the muddy lane. He said the boy's head was tilted back, his face turned up to the starless sky, and his mouth was open, as if he were silently screaming or drinking in the night itself. The farmer had spurred his horse on, a cold dread making him whip the reins harder than he ever had before. These two stories, combined with the disappearance of Lydia Bellows, coalesced into a single, terrifying narrative in the minds of the townspeople. The constable, a practical man named Hewitt, felt the pressure of the town's escalating panic. He took two of his deputies and went to the Roarke house. He found Eleanor Roarke sweeping the front porch. Her movements were calm, almost serene, a chilling counterpoint to the hysteria gripping the rest of the town. She looked up as the men approached, her eyes showing no surprise, only a weary resignation. The constable asked to speak with her son. She told him Nathaniel was in his room, resting. She said he had been unwell all night, suffering from one of his fevers. The constable pressed her. He told her about the sightings. He described the boy seen by the river, the boy seen in the lane. He asked her if Nathaniel had left his bed at all during the night. Eleanor Roarke's face remained a placid mask. She said her son had not left his room. She had been with him the entire night, tending to his fever. She said he had been sleeping soundly. Her voice was steady, her gaze direct. It was the unwavering testimony of a devoted mother. The constable, though he did not believe her, was a man of the law. He had no evidence, no grounds to enter the house without her permission. He asked to see the boy, just to confirm he was there. Eleanor refused. She said her son was too ill to be disturbed. One of the deputies, a younger man, less bound by procedure, pointed to the hem of the woman's own dress. It was damp and flecked with dark mud, the same kind of mud from the lane where the farmer had seen the boy. The constable saw it too. He asked her how her dress had gotten so soiled if she had been inside all night. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Eleanor Roarke's face. It was not fear, it was annoyance, a flash of cold anger. She glanced down at her dress, then back at the constable. She said she had been out to the well early that morning. The ground was wet. Her voice was sharp, daring him to challenge her. The constable was at an impasse. He had suspicions, sightings, and a town on the verge of forming a mob, but he had no proof. He asked one final question. He asked to see Nathaniel's nightshirt. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, her eyes cold. Then, without a word, she turned and went back into the house. She returned a minute later holding a white cotton nightshirt. It was neatly folded. She held it out to the constable. He took it. The fabric was damp, not wet, but holding a distinct cellar-like dampness, and at the bottom, around the hem, were dark, telltale streaks of mud and grass stains. The constable held it up. He asked her to explain it. Eleanor Roarke looked at the nightshirt, and then back at the men. Her expression did not change. She said it must have become soiled in the laundry basket. She said it was an old stain. She offered the explanation with a chilling lack of concern, as if the laws of logic were minor inconveniences that did not apply to her or her son. The constable knew she was lying. Everyone knew she was lying. But her denial was absolute, a stone wall against which their questions shattered. There was nothing more he could do, not without overstepping his authority and risking a violent confrontation. He handed the nightshirt back to her. He warned her to keep her son indoors. He told her the town was in an ugly mood. Then he and his deputies left, the damp, muddy nightshirt a searing image in their minds. The news of the constable's visit, of Eleanor Roarke's impossible denials, and the state of the boy's nightclothes was the final spark. The town's fear ignited into open rage. Thomas Bellows, broken by his grief, began to openly accuse Nathaniel Roarke of taking his daughter. He said the boy was a demon, a creature sent from hell to prey on their children. His raw, agonizing grief gave voice to the town's deepest fears. That evening, a crowd began to gather in the town square. It started with a few angry men, but their numbers quickly swelled. They carried lanterns and pitchforks and hunting rifles. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering torchlight, were twisted with a mixture of fear and righteous fury. They were no longer neighbors and farmers. They were a mob, and they were marching toward the small, silent house at the edge of town. Dr. Blackwood watched the procession form from the window of his office. He saw the firelight glinting off the rifle barrels. He saw the madness in their eyes. He knew what was about to happen. He had seen this coming, had felt it building for weeks. He was terrified of the boy, of the thing that wore the boy's skin. But he was also a doctor. He had taken an oath to preserve life, and he knew the mob would not stop with the boy. They would take the mother too. He felt a sudden, terrible clarity. The mystery of Nathaniel Roarke, the question of what he was, had become a secondary concern. The immediate crisis was the violence about to be unleashed. He had to do something. He could not stop the mob with reason. He could not fight them. But maybe he could uncover a truth so definitive, so undeniable, that it would cut through the hysteria. He would not join the mob. He would not hide in his office. He would begin his own investigation. He would bypass the whispers and the sightings and go to the source. He would find out where the Roarkes came from. He would write to his colleagues in Boston. He would search for records, for death certificates, for any piece of paper that could explain the origin of the boy who did not belong to the world of the living. He turned away from the window and the approaching mob and lit a lamp on his desk. He would fight the darkness outside with the only weapon he had left, a desperate search for a logical, documented truth, hoping it was a truth he could find before the town tore itself apart. He had to believe that an answer existed, somewhere in the ink and paper of the past. While the anger of the mob surged through the streets of Concord, a different kind of frantic energy consumed Dr. Aldous Blackwood. He barricaded the door to his office, not against the townsfolk, but against the distracting chaos of their fury. He ignored the shouts and the glow of torches passing his window. The immediate violence on the street was a symptom. He needed to understand the disease. His desk, usually a model of perfect order, was now a storm of paper and ink. He was a man of science, and in the face of the supernatural, he clung to the only process he trusted: research. His first action was to consult his own extensive medical library. He pulled down heavy, leather-bound volumes, their pages whispering with the dust of ages. He searched for hours, hunting for any known condition that could mimic what he had witnessed. He looked for congenital heart defects that could produce an impossibly slow pulse. He read about rare neurological disorders that might induce a catatonic state or cause delusions. He scoured chapters on hypothermia and circulatory failure. Every page was a dead end. Medical science had no category for a child with skin as cold as stone who was not already dead from exposure. There was no known ailment that allowed a heart to beat only 8 times per minute while the patient remained conscious and articulate. There was certainly no disease listed in his books, whose symptoms included a perfect, detailed knowledge of another person's long-buried childhood memories. To explain what he had seen with Nathaniel Roarke required him to venture into the forbidden territories of superstition, into the very folklore he had spent his entire life dismissing. He slammed the final book, shut in frustration. The answers were not in his library. The affliction was not of the body, as he understood it. His next step was to harness the power of his professional network. He sat down and began to write, his pen scratching furiously across the page. He composed a long, carefully worded letter to a former mentor at Harvard Medical School, a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, who was renowned for his work with unusual and unclassifiable cases. Dr. Blackwood was cautious in his wording. He did not write of a demon or a supernatural entity. He knew such language would have his letter dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed rural physician. Instead, he framed it as a complex diagnostic puzzle. He described a hypothetical patient, an 11-year-old boy. He detailed the extreme bradycardia, the 8 beats per minute. He noted the fixed, dilated pupils and the profound hypothermia of the skin, coexisting with what appeared to be normal cognitive function. He described the boy's unnatural placidity. He omitted the most incredible detail, the recitation of his own memories, knowing it would strain credulity to the breaking point. He simply asked if Dr. Thorne, in his long and varied experience, had ever encountered or read of a similar confluence of symptoms. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the Morning Post, a small, desperate vessel of inquiry sent out into a sea of uncertainty. He then wrote other, shorter letters. He wrote to the physicians in the towns surrounding Concord, asking if a family by the name of Roarke, a widow and her son, had ever resided in their communities. He was searching for a trail, a history, a point of origin. The Roarkes had arrived in Concord as if from nowhere. People did not simply materialize. They had to come from somewhere. There had to be a record. While he waited for the post and for replies that might take weeks, his investigation turned to the more immediate past. He focused on the boy's father. Eleanor Roarke was a widow. That meant her husband had died. And where there was a death, there was a death certificate. There was a record. He traveled the next day to the county seat, a larger town a half-day's ride away. The county records office was a dim, dusty hall, filled with the scent of aging paper and sealing wax. It was a library of lives and deaths, marriages and property deeds, the official story of the region written in looping cursive. The clerk, a small bespectacled man, was reluctant to help. He was suspicious of the doctor's urgent, almost feverish demeanor. But Dr. Blackwood was persistent, invoking his professional standing and the pressing nature of a medical inquiry. He started his search. He did not know the father's first name, nor the place of his death. He began a slow, methodical search of the mortality records for the entire county, going back 2 years. He scanned page after page of names, dates, and causes of death. Cholera, consumption, falling from a horse, drowning. The mundane and tragic litany of 19th century life. He found it late in the afternoon, as the light began to fade outside the tall, grimy windows. The name was there, in stark black ink. Roarke, Jonathan. Age, 34. Date of death, 1 year prior. The place of death was listed as an unincorporated township on the far eastern edge of the county, a small, isolated settlement he had barely heard of. But it was the cause of death that made the doctor's blood run cold. The line was not filled in. It was not left blank. Instead, a single, jarring phrase was written in a heavy, official hand. It said, "By order of the county magistrate." The record was sealed. A sealed death certificate was almost unheard of. Records were sealed for reasons of state security or to protect the identities of those involved in a deeply scandalous or criminal affair. For an ordinary man, a farmer or a laborer, to have his cause of death officially concealed by the highest legal authority in the county was a profound and disturbing anomaly. It meant that whatever had happened to Jonathan Roarke was something the authorities did not want known. It was a truth they had actively officially buried. Dr. Blackwood tried to press the clerk for more information. He asked about the magistrate's order. The clerk became visibly agitated. He said he knew nothing. He said the file was sealed, and that was the end of it. He refused to look the doctor in the eye. He was afraid. The doctor realized that whatever had happened to Jonathan Roarke had left a lingering fear that still held sway in the halls of official record. Defeated but with a new, terrible piece of the puzzle, Dr. Blackwood returned to Concord. The mob had dispersed the night before, turned back at the Roarke's gate, not by the constable, but by the unnerving calm of Eleanor Roarke herself. She had met them at the door, holding a lamp, her face serene, and had simply told them to go home, that there was nothing for them there. Her lack of fear, her utter placidity in the face of their rage, had unnerved them more than any defense could have. The mob had faltered, its righteous fury dissolving into confused dread, and the men had drifted back to their homes. The town was now held in a state of suspended terror. The disappearance of Lydia Bellows was an open wound, and the Roarke house was the salt rubbed into it. The people stayed in their homes after dark. A heavy, watchful silence had fallen over Concord. Dr. Blackwood knew he had to speak to Eleanor Roarke again. He had to confront her with what he had found. He went to the house in the middle of the day, hoping the sunlight would offer some small protection against the oppressive atmosphere of the place. He found her in the small, barren yard, hanging laundry on a line. The clothes were all stark white, shirts and sheets, bleached to an almost luminous purity. She saw him approach but did not stop her work, her movements graceful and unhurried. The doctor did not waste time. He stood a few feet away from her, the laundry line a fragile barrier between them. He told her he knew her husband's name was Jonathan. He told her he had found the death certificate. He told her it was sealed. Eleanor paused, a white sheet in her hands. She turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, a calm, placid surface. She said nothing. The doctor pressed on, his voice low and urgent. He said he needed to know what happened to her husband. He said the town was on a knife's edge. He said another child might disappear. He said he needed to understand the nature of her son's affliction. Eleanor Roarke looked at the doctor, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of an emotion in her eyes. It was not sadness or grief. It was a cold, distant pride. She spoke, her voice as smooth and cool as river water. She said her husband was a brilliant man. She said he was a man of science, though not a doctor. He was a student of nature, of its deepest and most hidden patterns. She spoke of him in the reverent tones one might use for a saint or a prophet. The doctor asked her how he died. Her eyes hardened. The brief warmth vanished. She said it was not an illness. She said there was an accident, an experiment that had gone wrong. Her words were clipped, final. It was clear she would say no more about the circumstances of his death. He changed his approach. He asked her about Nathaniel. He said the boy's condition, it must have begun after his father's death. He suggested the trauma of the event might have triggered it. Eleanor Roarke gave a small, chilling smile. It did not touch her eyes. She said the doctor was mistaken. She said Nathaniel's condition had not begun after his father's death. She said Nathaniel had always been this way. Then she said the words that would haunt the doctor for the rest of his life. She looked from the doctor to her son, who was now standing in the doorway of the house, a pale, silent observer. She said Nathaniel did not just suffer from the same condition as his father. She said Nathaniel resembled his father in every way. It was not just a physical resemblance she spoke of. The implication was far more profound, far more monstrous. She was not just the boy's mother. She was the boy's keeper. She was the guardian of a legacy. Dr. Blackwood stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. The father, Jonathan Roarke, had not died. Not in the conventional sense. The experiment had not been a failure. It had been a success. He had not died. He had been transformed. And Nathaniel was not his son in the normal way. He was his father's continuation. He was the next stage of the experiment. The doctor felt a wave of vertigo, the solid ground seeming to shift beneath his feet. He had been looking for the origin of a disease. He had been wrong. This was not an illness to be cured. This was a lineage, an inheritance of an unnatural state of being. He backed away from the house, from the calm, smiling woman and the silent, watching boy. He had his answer. It was not a truth that could be used to calm a mob. It was a truth that could drive a man insane. He knew with a chilling certainty that there was no help to be found in Boston. No medical journal held the key. The answers lay in the sealed past of Jonathan Roarke and the unfolding, terrifying future of his son. He had to warn the town. He had to do something. But what? How do you fight a shadow that has been passed down from father to son? He turned and walked away, his mind reeling, knowing that his investigation had only uncovered a deeper, more fundamental darkness than he had ever imagined possible. The revelation in the Roarke's yard left Dr. Aldous Blackwood profoundly shaken. He returned to his office not as a man of science seeking answers, but as a man who had stared into an abyss and seen it stare back. The words of Eleanor Roarke echoed in his mind. He resembled his father in every way. It was not an affliction, it was a lineage. The thought was a poison, dissolving the foundations of his rational world. He spent the night in his chair, the fire in his hearth dying to gray embers, the letters to his colleagues lying unposted on his desk. What could he write to them now? What scientific language could contain the monstrous truth he suspected? He felt a crushing sense of isolation. He was the sole custodian of a truth that no one else in Concord could possibly comprehend. To speak of it openly would be to brand himself a madman. By dawn, a new resolve had hardened within him. He could not fight this thing with medicine or reason. He could not appeal to the law, which had already shown its willingness to bury the truth about Jonathan Roarke. He had only one path left. He had to confront it directly. He had to see for himself what was inside that house. He had to find proof, some tangible evidence that could be understood, that could be shown, that could make the world believe what he now knew. He waited until mid-morning, when the town was alive with the mundane business of the day. He told no one where he was going. He walked to the edge of town, his heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. He did not know what he would do when he got there. He only knew he could not continue to live with the unanswered questions and the gnawing terror. As he approached the Roarke house, a strange stillness struck him. It was a different kind of silence from the one that usually enveloped the property. The usual sense of a watchful, latent presence was gone. The air felt empty, inert. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, despite the morning's chill. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. A feeling of deep unease settled over him. This was wrong. The house, which had always felt so sealed and controlled, now felt abandoned, violated. He called out. First, he called for Eleanor. Then, he called for Nathaniel. His voice was swallowed by the silence. There was no reply. With his heart pounding, he pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The cold hit him immediately. It was a profound, tomb-like cold, far deeper than he had experienced before. The fire in the main room's hearth was dead, a pile of black ash and charred logs. It looked as if it had been out for a day or more. The sparse furniture was still in its place, clean and orderly, but the house felt hollow, devoid of life. It felt like a stage after the actors have departed. He moved through the small downstairs rooms, his footsteps echoing unnaturally. The kitchen was spotless, no food left out, no dishes in the sink. It was as if no one had ever lived there. He went upstairs. The 2 small bedrooms were just as barren. The beds were neatly made. The few clothes they owned were gone from the small wardrobe. They had vanished. Sometime in the night, Eleanor and Nathaniel Roarke had packed their meager belongings and slipped away from Concord as silently as they had arrived. A wave of relief washed over the doctor, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. They were gone. The affliction, the source of the town's terror, had departed. But the relief was swiftly followed by a new, colder dread. They had not been driven out. They had simply left. Their work in Concord, whatever it had been, was complete. They had moved on. The thought of them arriving in another unsuspecting town, of another community being slowly enveloped by their chilling presence, was terrifying. As he stood in the cold, empty silence of the boy's bedroom, his eyes fell upon the one object that had been left behind. On a small, simple wooden desk tucked under the window, there sat a single book. It was a handsome volume, bound in dark brown leather, like a physician's ledger or a personal journal. It looked out of place in the otherwise barren room. Driven by a powerful instinct, the doctor walked over to the desk. He reached out and touched the cover. The leather was cool and smooth. He opened it. The pages were filled with writing. It was a child's handwriting, but unnervingly precise and controlled. The script was small, neat, and perfectly formed, each letter a work of careful calligraphy. There was not a single smudge or crossed-out word on any page he could see. He began to read, and as he did, the full, incomprehensible horror of the situation was revealed to him. This was not a child's diary. It was a scientific journal. It was a record of clinical observations. The book was filled with entries, each one dated and meticulously detailed. They were case studies. Each entry began with the heading, Subject, but there were no names. The subjects were referred to only by a number and a location. Subject 74, Lowell. Subject 75, Salem. Subject 76, Danvers. The locations were a string of towns and cities stretching back through the years, a map of a secret, horrifying pilgrimage. Each entry was a dispassionate, clinical analysis of a single person. It detailed their age, their health, their fears, their private sorrows. The notebook described a farmer in Lowell, Subject 74, who was consumed with anxiety over a failing crop. It detailed his sleep patterns, his arguments with his wife, the contents of his prayers. It was an intimate, invasive record of a man's soul, all recorded in the same calm, precise, childish hand. Then came the section labeled Examination. This part of each entry described a process. It spoke of introducing a stimulus, a carefully targeted source of fear or anxiety. It recorded the subject's reaction, the physical changes, the rising panic, the spiritual decay. The entries were chilling in their detachment. They read like the notes of a biologist studying a specimen in a jar. There was no empathy, no morality. There was only observation and analysis. The doctor flipped through the pages, his hands trembling. The entries spanned decades. Decades. The handwriting was the same throughout. It was impossible. This was the work of a lifetime, a long, patient study. But it was written in the hand of a child. The implication was staggering. The being known as Nathaniel Roarke was not 11 years old. It was ancient. The boy was merely the latest vessel, the current form it wore. The lineage he had suspected was not one of blood, but of a singular consciousness passed from one form to another, continuing its dreadful work across generations. The father, Jonathan, had not been the first. He had only been the previous. The doctor's gaze fell upon a more recent entry. Subject 82, Concord. He began to read, his blood turning to ice. The entry described Lydia Bellows. It detailed her age, her love for her father, her small collection of creek stones. It spoke of her fear of the dark, a fear that the writer noted was common in subjects of her age and therefore a reliable vector for the initial approach. The examination section was short. It noted the successful extraction of the subject from her home. It described her initial fear, followed by a state of calm compliance. The final note on the subject was a single chilling phrase. It said, "Assimilation complete, sustenance value high." Lydia Bellows had not been kidnapped. She had been harvested. He felt a wave of nausea and stumbled back from the desk. He had to get out of the house. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught the final page. There was only one entry on it, written at the very top. The ink was still fresh, darker than the rest. It must have been written that very morning, just before they left. The entry was different from the others. It was not a case study. It was a self-assessment. The heading was, "Patient." The entry read, "The current vessel has stabilized. The condition is perfected. Integration of the host's residual memories with the primary consciousness is seamless, allowing for more effective social mimicry than in previous iterations. The slow pulse stasis is efficient, requiring minimal caloric intake. Further study is required to determine the upper limits of its influence on a community's collective emotional state. A new location with a larger population is indicated for the next phase of research. The patient is ready." The doctor stared at the words, his mind struggling to process the cold alien intelligence behind them. The patient is ready. The condition perfected. This was not a family fleeing in the night. It was a researcher moving to a new laboratory. He slammed the book shut. He could not leave it here. This was the proof. This was the terrible, impossible truth. He tucked the leather-bound notebook inside his coat, the feel of it like a block of ice against his chest. He fled the house, running without looking back, leaving the cold, empty rooms to the silence. Nathaniel Roarke and his mother were never seen again in Concord. The disappearance of Lydia Bellows became a tragic, unsolved mystery, a ghost story that would be told to frighten children for generations to come. Dr. Blackwood never showed the notebook to anyone. How could he? Who would believe him? He locked it in a safe in his office, a dark secret he would carry to his grave. His letters to his colleagues eventually received replies. His mentor, Dr. Thorne, wrote back that the described symptoms were medically impossible and gently suggested that the strains of a rural practice might be taking their toll. The physicians in the surrounding towns replied that they had no record of a family named Roarke. But years later, Dr. Blackwood would occasionally read a small, buried news item from a distant town, a strange report from some other corner of New England. It would speak of a community gripped by a sudden, inexplicable wave of fear. It would mention strange occurrences, of livestock found dead, of a child gone missing, and sometimes, the report would contain a small, chilling detail. It would speak of the arrival of a quiet widow and her pale, silent son, a boy that all the local physicians, for reasons they could not quite articulate, refused to examine. And the doctor would know the patient was ready. The research was continuing. The case file on Nathaniel Roarke is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, subscribe to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.